The air was thick inside the marble-walled hearing room of Capitol Hill. Reporters had already started to gather, buzzing like bees in a hive, cameras clicking and pens scratching as though they could sense what was coming. Something big. Something fiery. On one side of the room sat Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or as the media loved to call her, AOC. Young, sharp, and known for her piercing questions that often left witnesses flustered and her political opponents scrambling for cover. With her signature glasses perched perfectly on her nose and a pile of color-coded documents in front of her, she was ready for a showdown. Across from her sat Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, leaning back ever so slightly in his chair, calm. As a swamp gator in July, known for his southern drawl and his gift for crafting razor-sharp one-liners, Kennedy had turned Senate hearings into something resembling stand-up routines, only with more consequences. Today wasn't supposed to be about either of them. It was a routine joint session to discuss federal oversight of social media algorithms. But when AOC requested an unscheduled round of questioning, something seemed off. She was gearing up for something. A moment. A trap. Senator Kennedy. She began with a glint in her eye. "I'd like to ask you a few questions. Just for clarity." That line alone made 3 staffers on Kennedy's side look up from their laptops. AOC didn't ask for clarity. She set traps. She used the pretense of clarity, like a lion licks its paws before the pounce. Kennedy turned slowly toward her, nodding with that classic Southern charm. "Okay, well, Congresswoman, I always say clarity is next to godliness," he replied with a slight grin. "Fire away." AOC started off gently, asking vague, seemingly harmless questions about misinformation, digital regulation, and user privacy. But each question was a breadcrumb, leading toward a trap. Her tone shifted slightly. Her language sharpened. "Would you say, Senator, that promoting religious-based misinformation on public platforms is a form of free speech, even if it harms marginalized communities?" she asked carefully. The room quieted. Kennedy raised an eyebrow. Everyone knew where this was going. AOC was laying the groundwork to connect his past votes, public comments, and party-line defenses to something toxic, something she could label as bigotry or willful ignorance. Kennedy tapped his pen lightly on the table. "Well now, Congresswoman," he said slowly, "I believe in free speech, the same way I believe in sweet tea and sunshine. Even if it burns sometimes, it's still better than silence in the dark." That earned a few chuckles. But AOC didn't flinch. She continued, now referencing obscure policy memos, internal staff emails, and cherry-picked quotes from Kennedy's previous interviews. The strategy was clear. Overwhelm him, corner him, and then land the viral moment. She had done it before. 2 seasoned CEOs, 2 former cabinet officials, 2 judges with decades of experience. Her skill in questioning was part interrogation, part TikTok theater. Kennedy, however, didn't blink. He let her finish her elaborate preamble of 5-minute wind-up of ideological framing, word traps, and emotional appeals. Then, as the room sat still and reporters prepped their headlines in their minds, he leaned in, smiled slightly, and said, "Well, Miss Ocasio-Cortez, bless your heart, but I think you might be barking up the wrong constitutional amendment." Silence hung in the room like a suspended breath. You could feel the tension in the air, as if everyone in the walls were leaning in to hear what Kennedy would say. "Next, barking up the wrong constitutional amendment?" AOC repeated, a little smirk tugging at the corner of her lips. "That's an interesting way to deflect, Senator." Kennedy's grin didn't budge. He reached for his notes barely, glanced at them, then looked right back at her. His voice was calm, measured, and coated with that trademark Louisiana syrup. "Congresswoman," began, "with all due respect, the First Amendment doesn't come with asterisks. You don't get to support it only when it agrees with your worldview and then toss it out when it doesn't play nice." She leaned forward. "So you're saying all speech should be protected even speech that causes harm?" Kennedy chuckled softly. Now. That's like blaming the weatherman for the rain. Free speech is messy, sure, but it's the mess that keeps us free." There it was. The flip. Instead of defending his past comments or retreating from her loaded phrasing, Kennedy pivoted. He turned the conversation from a moral accusation into a constitutional principle. And just like that, the trap door she'd spent the last 10 minutes building slammed shut with her standing on it. But AOC wasn't done, not by a long shot. "Let me reframe this," she said, adjusting her papers. "Let's talk about responsibility. Do public officials have no duty to correct harmful rhetoric when it spreads online under their name?" Kennedy's eyes sparkled. "Well, sugar," he said, "I reckon if we banned every harmful opinion, half of Congress would be out of a job, including some folks who spend a lot of time on social media. A ton." The jab wasn't subtle in it. Hit hard, reporters in the back nearly dropped their pens. Staffers exchanged glances. AOC blinked, but to her credit, she didn't flinch. "I'm not talking about banning opinions," she replied. "Talking about accountability." Kennedy leaned forward now, serious. The charm was still there, but the drawl sharpened. Just slightly, like a dull knife suddenly honed. "Then let's talk about that," he said. "You've got every right to call folks out. You've done it. Loudly. And that's your right. Accountability works both ways, Congresswoman. When you accuse people of bigotry or hate and turn disagreement into a moral crime, that's not accountability. That's intimidation." AOC sat back slightly. That wasn't the answer she expected. She had walked him into a trap, thinking he'd fumble, backtrack, or deflect like most politicians. But instead, Kennedy had grabbed the bait, turned it inside out, and hung it back in front of her. He wasn't playing defense. He had flipped the field. The hearing chair tried to move things along, but it was too late. The room had already shifted. The momentum was no longer with AOC. She narrowed her eyes and responded, "So you're saying words don't have consequences?" Kennedy raised one finger. "Words absolutely have consequences. But in America, you don't silence folks because you're uncomfortable. You answer M. You debate M. And if you can't beat them with better ideas, maybe your ideas ain't all that good to begin with." If there was ever a moment when the dynamic in the room shifted, it was now. AOC had gone in with fire questions laced with legal nuance and moral implications. But Kennedy had managed not just to withstand the pressure, he had flipped it like a seasoned courtroom veteran. And now, as the crowd settled from the verbal sparring, he did something that nobody expected. He pulled out her tweets. Yes, her actual tweets. On live congressional record. "Madam Chair," Kennedy said, with that southern syrup still clinging to his words, "I'd like to enter into the record a few public statements made by the Congresswoman's statements, which I believe speak volumes about selective outrage." The room stirred. AOC's team stiffened. Her communications director, seated a few rows back, reached for his phone. AOC's voice cut in fast. "If we're here to discuss my tweets, then we're wasting taxpayer time." Kennedy didn't miss a beat. "Well, Congresswoman, you're the one who brought up accountability. I'm just making sure we apply it evenly." April 2023, he read. You tweeted, quote, "The GOP is enabling white supremacy by protecting online hate speech." He let it hang in the air. "Now, I ask you," he said, looking directly at her, "is that constructive debate? Or is that branding every Republican? Who disagrees with your view as a bigot?" AOC opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy pressed on. June 2022, he continued. "Pro-lifers don't care about babies once they're born. Their ideology is rooted in cruelty, not compassion." He looked around the room. "That's not just a policy disagreement, Congresswoman. That's a character assassination of millions of Americans." The room was no longer just watching. A hearing, it was watching a political masterclass, a reverse interrogation live on C-SPAN. AOC interrupted, voice sharp. "Senator, there's a difference between criticizing systemic injustice and targeting individuals." What I said, but Kennedy cut in smoothly. Double quotes. "Oh, I understand the difference, all right," he said. "But when you wrap a slander in moral virtue, it's still a slander. You don't get to lecture others on the dangers of rhetoric while casually painting half the country as hateful." For a moment, AOC sat silent, not because she didn't have a response, but because she realized something chilling. This was no longer her ambush. Kennedy had wrestled the spotlight away. He'd come prepared. The usual script to one where the older conservative politician stumbles under her fire wasn't playing out. Instead, Kennedy was holding up a mirror to her own words, and the mirror was brutal. "Look," Kennedy added, his tone softening just slightly. "We all get passionate. Lord knows I've said things I regret, but you can't play referee and quarterback at the same time. If you want accountability, it starts with yourself." The room fell still. Even some on AOC's side didn't quite know how to respond. Kennedy wasn't yelling. He wasn't grandstanding. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was making sense. AOC finally responded, but her voice was tighter now. Less fire, more calculation. "Words from years ago don't negate the structural harm caused by letting hate speech run free," she said. But even as she said it, her confidence had dimmed. The trap she'd set had become a hall of mirrors. And now, everyone was watching to see who could find the way out. By now, the room had transformed. What began as a seemingly one-sided interrogation had turned into a high-stakes debate on free speech, accountability,
Out.
and the shifting ground beneath the feet of American democracy. AOC sat poised, but her usual dominance over the room had clearly been checked. Meanwhile, Kennedy leaned in, still calm, still cordial, but now steering the conversation with precision. He adjusted his microphone and spoke slowly, but deliberately. "You say some speech causes harm," he said, looking directly at her. "I don't disagree. But I got a simple question for you, Congresswoman." He paused. The pause was surgical. Who decides what counts as hate? The question hit like a drumbeat. It was both simple and seismic. And in that moment, everyone understood its weight, because behind that question lay deeper fears, the kind that stretch beyond party lines and pierce into the heart of freedom itself. AOC answered quickly. Too quickly. "Well, Senator, hate speech is generally recognized as speech that incites violence, discrimination, or harassment against protected groups." Kennedy nodded. "Fair enough. But let me ask you this. So if someone says, 'I believe biological sex is real,' and someone else feels harmed by that, is that hate speech?" AOC hesitated. "That depends on the context," she replied cautiously. Kennedy's grin returned, just a flicker. "Exactly," he said. "It always does. Once you let context define legality, you're not enforcing the law anymore. You're enforcing ideology." The crowd shifted in their seats again. Now Kennedy was going beyond rhetoric. He was dissecting the very framework behind AOC's arguments, suggesting that her approach to misinformation and hate speech wasn't about protecting people, but about controlling speech. A slippery slope that made some in the room visibly uncomfortable. AOC leaned in. "No one's talking about banning opinions, Senator," she said. "We're talking about deplatforming hate." Kennedy leaned back, and "There it is," he said softly. "Now we're not just talking about speech. We're talking about power. About who gets to silence who. I gotta ask, if your side is always the one deciding what's allowed and what's not, then how free are the rest of us, really?" Silence. Again, AOC's staffers were visibly restless now. This wasn't the headline they came for. The Congresswoman shifted tactics. "So what's your solution, Senator?" she asked. "Let the internet turn into a hate-filled Wild West, where marginalized groups are constantly attacked." Kennedy's response was instant. "No, ma'am," he said. "My solution is this. Teach people how to argue, not just how. To cancel, you don't protect democracy by duct-taping mouths shut. You protect it by making sure every voice, the ones you hate, gets heard." It was a powerful statement, not because it was new, but because it was unapologetically old school. Kennedy wasn't offering a new law or flashy platform regulation. He was echoing a foundational idea that freedom isn't clean or safe or easy. It's messy, it's loud, it's hard, and that's why it matters. AOC's rebuttal was careful, but no longer commanding. Her tone had shifted from offense to defense. "I don't believe in censorship, Senator, but I believe in responsibility." "So do I," Kennedy replied gently. "But the minute you let the government become the judge of what's hateful, someone, where is going to put you on that list too." By this point, Even the panel moderator had stopped trying to steer the hearing. The floor belonged entirely to Senator John Kennedy and Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And it wasn't just a debate anymore. It had become a philosophical brawl between two very different Americas. AOC had come to call out what she saw as hypocrisy, misinformation, and hateful speech wrapped in patriotism. But Kennedy came armed with something else entirely. And now he was about to use it like a weapon. "Congresswoman," he said, "when the Founding Fathers sat down and wrote the First Amendment, they didn't do it to protect easy speech. They did it to protect speech that offends, speech that agitates, speech that makes people uncomfortable." He paused. Let it settle in. Because they just fought a war against a crown that decided what speech was acceptable. And believe me, kings always find your opinions offensive. You could hear a pin drop. Even the press gallery had gone quiet, pens poised mid-air. AOC responded carefully. "No one is trying to crown themselves king here, Senator. But we are in a digital age where harmful speech travels faster than ever. That changes things." Kennedy tilted his head slightly. "Oh, it changes the speed, sure, but not the principle." Leaned forward, voice sharpening. "If Thomas Jefferson were alive today, and he posted, 'I disagree with the government' on Twitter, you think he wouldn't get flagged, demonetized, shadow banned?" A few heads in the room nodded silently. And if George Washington stood up and said, "Let the people decide for themselves," would someone from Silicon Valley label that misinformation? AOC opened her mouth, but Kennedy cut in. "Again, because here's the thing. Congresswoman, this modern trend of silencing people under the banner of safety, that ain't progress. That's just old censorship dressed up in new clothes." AOC tried to counter with data studies on the rise of online extremism, statistics about algorithm-driven radicalization. Her points were sharp, intelligent, and well-researched. But Kennedy had shifted the terrain. He wasn't arguing on her battlefield anymore. He had taken the conversation up several floors to the balcony, where ideas are judged not by data points, but by principles. "Freedom," he said, "ain't free if you've got to ask permission to use it." AOC, still composed, fired back. "Then how do you reconcile freedom with responsibility? You say let everyone speak freely, but what if that speech leads to real-world violence?" Kennedy's reply was instant. "Then you prosecute the violence, not the opinion. Because the minute you outlaw speech based on what might happen, you're not defending victims, you're predicting crimes. That's not America. That's Orwell." And just like that, the hearing had turned into a courtroom. But the defendant wasn't Kennedy. It was the idea that speech should be filtered, managed, and restricted in the name of good intentions. AOC didn't yield, but her strategy had clearly stalled. She wasn't facing the usual political opponent. She was facing someone who could quote the Constitution as casually as he did. Barbecue recipes, and worse, he was doing it well. Kennedy reached for his final point in this round. "You want a world without offensive speech?" said then. "You want a world without dissent. And in that kind of world, nobody questions the powerful, which means sooner or later, the powerful become unstoppable." AOC's silence wasn't retreat, it was calculation. But the damage had been done in 5 sentences. Kennedy hadn't just defended free speech, he had reframed the conversation from safety to liberty, from policing ideas to protecting them. AOC sat forward now, her expression more intense than before. The ideological duel had lasted longer than most cable segments ever would. But she hadn't come to lose. If Kennedy wanted to fight in the arena of founding documents and philosophical liberty, she'd bring the heat from the heart of modern America: race, equity, and systemic injustice. She'd shifted the terrain before. She could do it again, Senator. She said clearly, "You've quoted the Founding Fathers a lot today. Men who owned slaves. Men who built a country on the backs of people who were never free to speak, or vote, or live." The room stiffened. This was not a question, it was a reframing. "So when you talk about protecting speech," she continued, "I want to know, where was that protection for people of color, for indigenous voices, for civil rights leaders labeled radicals?" And threat simply for demanding equality? It was bold. It was smart. She wasn't just appealing to history. She was challenging it. Questioning the moral foundation of the very freedoms Kennedy had defended. And she wasn't wrong. The record was messy. American freedom had often excluded the very people who needed it most. Most in the room expected Kennedy to dodge. Instead, he stunned everyone. You're right. Silence. He let it hang for a moment. Then he said it again. You're absolutely right, Congresswoman. AOC blinked. Even her staff looked momentarily frozen. I won't stand here and whitewash our history, he said. This country has failed a lot of people. Black Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, women, people whose stories never got written in the Constitution, but who built this nation all the same. It was the last thing anyone expected. Agreement. But Kennedy wasn't done. He was setting something up. And you know what made this country better over time? He asked, lifting his gaze to the room. Not silence, not censorship, but voices, loud ones, uncomfortable ones. People like Frederick Douglass, like Ida B. Wells, like Martin Luther King Jr. He turned to AOC. You know what they all had? In common, they used free speech to break chains. Not social credit, not government truth boards, but words. The room was hanging on his every sentence now. He had turned her strongest card into a rallying cry for the very principle he'd been defending all along. Martin Luther King was wiretapped by the FBI, labeled dangerous, silenced if your version of accountability. Had been law back then, he wouldn't have marched in Selma, he'd have been banned on Facebook. AOC tried to interject, but Kennedy held the room. I don't deny our sins, he said. But I believe the way we rise above them is by keeping speech open, even when it stings. Because censorship, Congresswoman, always starts with the promise of justice, then ends in silence. AOC sat. Still, she wasn't retreating. But she wasn't ready for that turn. She had hoped to corner Kennedy into defending outdated ideals. Instead, he honored the very activists she admired and used their voices to bolster his own argument. The trap had snapped again, only this time she was in it. AOC had tried constitutional law. She'd tried moral arguments. She'd shifted the frame to race, justice, and historical pain, and still, Kennedy had managed to meet her with wit, depth, and something far more dangerous than charm, coherence. But now, she had one more card to play. Corporate money, political corruption, power behind the curtain. She adjusted the mic. Calm, but assertive. Senator Kennedy, she began. It's no secret that some of your biggest donors are corporate interest energy companies, pharmaceutical giants, and major tech players. The same companies that benefit from unrestricted speech online and from deregulation in Washington. The room stirred. She'd thrown down the gauntlet. So when you say you're defending free speech, she continued, are you really? Defending the average American or just the billion-dollar companies who fund your campaigns? It was the kind of accusation that usually sends politicians scrambling. No one wants to talk about their donor list on national television. But Kennedy. He smiled. Congresswoman, he said slowly. You ever heard the phrase pot meet kettle? Laughter, muffled but real, bubbled through the gallery. Because if you want to talk about money, he continued, flipping open a folder. Let's look at yours. Act Blue. The Sunrise Movement. Billionaire tech donors from California. Hollywood super PACs. People who don't live in your district, but sure do like to spend money on what you say. AOC's jaw tightened. This wasn't a surprise, but it wasn't the reaction she was hoping for either. Look, Kennedy said, leaning in, we've both got donors. The difference is I don't pretend I don't. You throw rocks at the system while cashing checks from it. AOC countered quickly. I raise money from grassroots movements, people organizing for justice, not oil barons. Kennedy grinned. And those movements don't have lobbyists? Come on now. Whether it's Chevron or Silicon Valley, everybody's got an angle. The real question is, do you speak for the people or for the trendsetters? AOC tried to pivot. The people who support me want equity, climate justice, racial justice. They want a world where corporations don't dominate democracy. Kennedy's response was ice cold. And you think silencing speech helps that, Congresswoman? Every time someone speaks out against these corporations, you want them fact-checked off the internet. But corporations? They've got PR departments and armies of lawyers. They don't need protecting. He leaned in again. You know who does need protecting? It's that working-class guy in Mississippi who says something clumsy online and loses his job, or that mom in Ohio who questions a school board policy and gets labeled a threat. Kennedy's voice dropped. They don't have lobbyists. They have opinions. And they're scared to speak because people like you are ready to call disagreement, hate, and criticism harm. AOC opened her mouth to respond. But for the first time, she hesitated, because she knew this was the heart of Kennedy's strategy. He wasn't playing culture war politics. He was invoking real people, forgotten ones, the kind who don't trend, don't donate, and don't march, but who watch hearings like this one and ask themselves, do they even hear me anymore? And in that moment, the answer was clear. Kennedy had heard them. He had made sure the room did too. AOC had been cornered, and everyone knew it. Her arguments, brilliantly framed and passionately delivered, had found a worthy challenger in Senator John Kennedy. But she wasn't ready to wave the white flag, not yet, because if she couldn't win the debate with law or history or morality, she'd go for the jugular character. She took a deep breath, straightened her back, and looked Kennedy dead in the eye. Senator, she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel, do you understand the real impact of what you're defending here today? Kennedy leaned forward slightly, listening. When you defend this kind of unregulated speech, when you argue that free speech is messy, what you're really doing is giving cover to extremist white nationalists, conspiracy theorists, anti-democracy forces. People who've already shown they'll use platforms to radicalize others. Her words struck the room like lightning. You could feel the air shift. A few gasps, some murmurs. Staffers fidgeted. Even the hearing chair looked uncomfortable. AOC wasn't just debating now, she was accusing. And for a moment, it looked like Kennedy might finally falter, but then he didn't. He blinked once, took a sip of water, and delivered a line so razor-sharp, so clean, it cut through the tension like a scalpel through silk. Congresswoman, he said, disagreement isn't extremism, and opposition isn't oppression. I thought the room went utterly. Still, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't strike theatrics. He just looked her in the eye and set it against lower, like a gavel falling. Disagreement isn't extremism, and opposition isn't oppression. AOC's eyes narrowed. Easy for you to say, Senator. You've never been on the receiving end of systemic hate. Kennedy nodded slowly. No, ma'am, I haven't. But I've also never used that fact to shut down someone else's right to speak. Because the minute you tie speech to guilt by associations, someone will use that rope on you. He glanced around the room, making sure everyone was listening. McCarthyism didn't start with bombs. It started with fear, accusing people of enabling the wrong ideas, with using safety to silence dissent. And Congresswoman, you're better than that. Even critics of Kennedy, those who had rolled their eyes at his down-home analogies and old-school defenses, had to admit. This was different. This was personal, controlled, devastating. You think calling out racism and hate speech is McCarthyism? She said. You think holding people accountable is some kind of witch hunt? Kennedy's voice didn't waver. No, ma'am. I think accountability is vital. But I also think there's a fine line between holding someone accountable. Branding everyone who disagrees with you is dangerous. He looked around the room again, and when the standard becomes agree with me or be labeled a threat, that's not justice. That's tyranny in pearls. That line hit like a hammer. Tyranny in pearls. Even some on AOC's side looked stunned. It wasn't just a zinger. It was a redefinition of the moment. A warning wrapped in velvet. And in just 5 words, Kennedy had turned AOC's entire approach, her platform, her power, presence into a symbol of something sinister, not activism. Not justice, control, And in that instant, tables weren't just turned, they were flipped, shattered, and rearranged. The chamber was still reeling from Kennedy's last line, tyranny in pearls. It wasn't just a jab, it was a THUNDERCLAP.AOC. Had come in with momentum backed by her usual precision and rhetorical firepower. But Kennedy had peeled back every layer of her argument and laid it bare, not with shouting, not with deflection, but with something much harder to counter: conviction. She sat in silence for a few moments, lips pursed, eyes locked forward, not defeated, but visibly shaken. Even her allies didn't know what she'd say next, and that's when it happened. A voice from the far end of the dais, unexpected, firm and clear. "Madam Chair, I'd like to make a brief comment." All heads turned. It was Representative Harold Gaines, a moderate Democrat from Michigan, AOC's own party, soft-spoken, usually avoided the spotlight. But now his voice echoed through the hearing chamber like a pin dropped in a cathedral. Alwack turned slightly, surprised. "Permission granted," the chair said. Gaines folded his hands, looked from Kennedy to AOC, and began. "I've listened carefully today to both of my colleagues. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez has raised legitimate concerns about extremism, online radicalization, and the importance of responsibility in speech. Those are real issues, serious ones." AOC nodded slightly, but Gaines continued. "I've also listened to Senator Kennedy remind us of something we seem too quick to forget: that protecting unpopular speech is not an endorsement of hate. It's a safeguard against tyranny." The room tensed. No, he was doing something much more dangerous to AOC. He was being fair. And publicly. "I agree," Gaines said, "that hateful rhetoric needs to be challenged. But I also believe we've reached a point where we're so afraid of the wrong voices being heard. We've stopped trusting the people to think for themselves." His eyes moved toward AOC. Silencing speech in the name of protecting people might feel noble, but it's a short road from safety to censorship. We've seen it in history. We're flirting with it now. OC didn't speak. She couldn't. Not yet. Because Gaines hadn't just shifted the political wind, he had cast doubt on the very premise she'd walked in with, not by opposing her, but by showing that even allies, careful, respected allies, were questioning her methods. And that was the moment it hit her. The reason Kennedy hadn't cracked, the reason he hadn't scrambled to defend himself, because he didn't come to win a debate. He came to protect an idea. She came with a strategy. He came with a principle, and now with Gaines voicing what others had only whispered. AOC felt something unfamiliar inside her. Not defeat, not embarrassment, but reflection. She glanced down at her notes, the color-coded questions, the carefully framed gotcha lines. They suddenly looked small, powerful, but small. To her credit, she didn't lash out, didn't pivot to outrage or mockery. She simply folded her papers, adjusted her mic, and spoke quietly. "You've made your point, Senator, and I'll consider it." It was just a sentence. But in that moment, it was everything, a rare thing. In politics, a moment not of surrender, but of sincerity. A crack in the wall. A sign that perhaps even amidst firestorms, truth can still get through. The hearing was coming to a close. The gavel hadn't dropped yet, but the political theater had reached its final act. No one shouted, no one grandstanded. The air was thick with a kind of solemn respect, the kind that only comes when something real, something rare has happened. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat still. She hadn't conceded anything formally, but she had lowered the sword. And in Washington, D.C., where most swords never leave the sheath, that alone was revolutionary. Across from her, Senator John Kennedy shuffled his papers, but he wasn't in a hurry. He was waiting, watching then. Just as the chair began to thank everyone and close the session, Kennedy raised a hand. "Madam Chair," he said, "one final remark for the record, if I may." The room froze. He didn't look at AOC. He looked at the room, at the cameras, at history. "I'm no stranger to being disagreed with. Lord knows half the internet thinks I'm a fossil with a drawl. And that's fine. It's America." He smiled faintly, letting the room breathe. But I want to say this clearly, so there's no confusion about what I stood for today. I'd rather live in a country where I have to hear things I don't like than in a country where people are too scared to speak at all. The words hung there, untouched, undisturbed, undeniable, no spin, no insult, no defense, just a belief. A core principle. Kennedy didn't say it with a smirk. He didn't toss it like a grenade. He offered it like someone handing off a torch, hoping it wouldn't be dropped. AOC turned slightly to look at him. And in that moment, for the first time all day, it was something between them that wasn't tension or opposition or strategy. Respect to political warriors from opposite ends of the ideological universe. And yet bound, even briefly, by a mutual understanding. This democracy is only as strong as the voices we allow to rise within it. The gavel fell. The hearing adjourned. Reporters scrambled. Headlines were already being written. Twitter exploded. Pundits spun their takes before. The marble doors had even closed. But the people watching at home, it's the ones who weren't paid to pick sides. They heard something else. Not just a debate. Not just fireworks. They heard what happens when conviction meets courage, when truth, no matter how uncomfortable, is allowed to speak without fear of being silenced. And somewhere between the first question and the last answer, AOC tried to trap Kennedy. But in the end, she walked into something stronger than any soundbite. A man who still believed in the power of speech in the country that depends on it.